Hello there and welcome back to JJ Reviews. I am JJ and today we are going to be reviewing Dark Imperium by Guy Haley. And for today we are going to be painting a Primaris Marine because they feature quite heavily in there from the brand new Indomitus kit. So I know it didn't come out at about the same time as the book, but here we go anyway. I thought it'd be a fun one just to do as a bit of a retro review, especially seeing as how we're now going into a whole new era of the 40k universe. So, without further ado, on with the review. Dark Imperium by Guy Haley is the first novel to introduce us to the new state of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Imperium has been split in two by a massive cosmic storm called the Great Rift. The enemies of humanity are rampaging across space with impunity, and the Imperium is closer than ever to extermination. All is not lost, though. The Primarch Robote Guilliman is back. Yes, the demigod who wrote the book on how to be a space marine has returned, and naturally is now in charge of the Imperium. Even though he is back, he is facing a massive threat to the Imperium from outside and within, whilst also adapting to how much the empire he helped build has changed after his many millennium in slumber. Set towards the end of the famous Indomitus Crusade, that saw the introduction of the new Primaris Space Marines, Dark Imperium shows us how the Imperium of Man and its new protector must face the threats in front of them, and it's our first look at this new, somehow darker Imperium. So just a bit of background first of all. Guilliman is a Primarch, a genetically engineered demigod who is also a genius general. After the Horus Heresy, he was wounded by his brother Fulgrim and was placed into stasis for 10,000 years, after which time he was awakened to find himself in a vastly different Imperium to the one he left. I don't even think they give the poor man time to have a coffee and a stretch. It's just straight into your new armour and off he goes. But anyway, the story follows Robert Guilliman primarily on his journey to restoring order to the divided Imperium and get to grips with his new surroundings. One of the things that stood out to me was how interesting Guilliman has been developed both emotionally and intellectually as a character. For those who are familiar with the Horus Heresy novels, you know Guilliman was an important player, but he was still only part of a very large ensemble. Here he is allowed to take centre stage, and we see what takes place inside his head. His conflicts, his feelings about being the last Primarch, well, kind of, the last one loyal to the Imperium anyway, and his sense of dislocation at waking up 10,000 years later. However, we should take a second to confirm that this book takes place about 100 years after Guilliman wakes up, so hopefully he's had time to grab that coffee and maybe check his emails and pay any back taxes. But anyway, I digress. It also means that he has been able to get to grips with some things, but is still struggling with others. He is comfortably in charge of the Imperium, and his authority is respected, and his tactical acumen is as good as ever. However, he is still struggling with the fact that his father is now worshipped as a god, something that was taboo back in his day. Crucially, he is haunted by a sense of loneliness of being the last Primarch that is still loyal to the ideas his father established, and it is clear he misses his other brothers and the warriors he knew before he was wounded. There is also a sense of weariness to him, something that we haven't seen in a Primarch before. In the Heresies, the Primarchs feel relatively young, even though they are all over 200 years old by that point. Whereas here, Guilliman even expresses he feels older and more tired, which is an interesting point, as a Space Marine and the Primarchs have always held this ageless quality to them. But this slips here and gives us an insight into what time can do to the mind of even a supposedly immortal being. And the important thing to remember about this is probably the closest we're ever going to get to really getting to know what the Emperor was up against during the years of the Great Crusade and later the Horus Heresy, perhaps even into the age we're in now, where he's been on the Golden Throne. Guilliman shows that the weariness and the restraint and the massive amounts of strain that goes onto the shoulders of one being on a galactic empire is enormous. And even though I know that probably goes without saying, it's interesting to see how that manifests in someone like Guilliman. That gives us this much clearer insight into them. Because the other thing about the Great Crusade is that the Great Crusade was all about growth. And one of the big things about the 41st millennium is it's largely been about just trying to hold on to what little is left. But that's one of the things about this book, which is why it's changed up the formula. But this is one of the things that kept me reading, as I was intrigued to learn more about this new Guilliman. I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He is a man who finds himself out of time in a universe that has changed so fundamentally that virtually nothing is recognisable. Nonetheless, he is still able to take up command without hesitation. Seeing how he develops as a person is one of the most captivating qualities of this book, and even when battle rages. I should mention that Guilliman isn't the only one. There is a host of support characters who I also found themselves thrust into situations that are beyond them, and they are developing almost in line with Guilliman in some respects. The novel does have its drawbacks. The biggest one was that
even though this is the first novel to show us the new state of the Imperium, after the events of the Gathering Storm and the events that launched the Indomitus Crusade, the book starts at the end of this crusade. Guilliman started to rescue the Imperium before this happened. So there are a lot of discoveries and revelations Guilliman must have had, but we don't get to see any of them. Nor do we get to see the effects of the new Primaris Space Marines making first contact with their firstborn kin. In the lore that follows this novel, it was made clear that this was a point of contention, but it was not explored, so any chance to see how that conflict affected the Space Marines as a whole was somewhat undermined. There is also an interesting moment that highlights the other side of this. In the novel, where a group of Primaris Marines who have clearly fought together for some time are told they will be getting reassigned soon. Understandably, they react with sadness at a comradeship coming to an end, but again, this hasn't been established either in this book or a previous book. Therefore, we have no context as to what this relationship means to these Marines outside the exposition we are given. This quote sums up what I mean. Nearly all of Felix's old comrades were there. He knew them so well. There were also several faces he did not know. Far more numerous were the faces missing, all the warriors he had known and laughed with since he'd awakened a century ago. Now, we don't get to see any of those faces in this book, which is a shame. And as a result, this book, Dark Imperium, almost feels like it's a third or fourth installment in a series. And there are characters who are named throughout this book who are said to have had a century's worth of fighting together. And even though I know something similar does happen with Horus Heresy, arguably, the counter I have to that is that this was meant to be the next step in the story. We shouldn't jump over effectively 100 years worth of story to get to the end of the crusade at this point, and I do feel that that's one of the things that lets the book down a little bit. However, that's not to say that the book is bad. Far from it. As I mentioned earlier, Guilliman's character does so much to carry the story throughout, and it's one of the book's biggest strengths. Whether he's on the battlefield or in his own office, he is always an exciting character whenever he's in front of you. It helps that he's well-rounded in this book as well. He's more than just a general. I felt for him, and it's interesting to see a demigod so emotionally vulnerable and uncertain of himself and his surroundings. There is a popular school of thought that had Guilliman pegged as one of the more boring Primarchs. Now, the idea that a demigod is boring is ludicrous to me, but this aside, it seems to be an opinion that stuck. This book has helped put that idea to bed as far as I'm concerned, as we see an interesting introspective Guilliman. In some ways, this novel is also a subtle deconstruction of the Warhammer universe as a whole, and allows us to look at it from a new angle. There's this nice moment summed up in a quote from a regular human called Varens in this book. The brutality of the era had eroded much of humanity's gentler qualities. He was fully aware of the brevity of his life, so Varens enjoyed the view and the cold in a way that a man from a more peaceful age would not. Another note that adds to this is a quote from Guilliman when he's trying to connect the 10,000 years of history he has missed. The disciplined history, like so much else based on reason, had fallen foul of superstition, fanaticism, and the High Lords of Terror's need for iron control. This gives us some insight into just how brutal a galaxy Guilliman has found himself in. He is new to this universe as it is, and as such, his assessments are both very interesting, but also very apt, as they allow us to look at some of the core issues in the universe through a different lens, but also lightly make fun of some of the more confusing aspects of the lore, such as how the events of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy are rarely, if ever, referenced in the 40k novels in much detail. But also, this takes into account some of the lore that the community and the fans of Warhammer have been reading for years, and some of it is confusing, some of it's labyrinthine, and there are huge chunks of it which have been completely dropped in many respects. But to see it stated like this, it does get down to the core issues. The Imperium is not what it was during the Horus Heresy, and because the Horus Heresy books are simultaneously ongoing and very recent in the near 4 decades worth of canon that the Warhammer 40,000 universe has enjoyed, it really does show actually how different it's become in that time. But it's nice to see how the differences really contrasted in the universe itself, and does give you a fantastic reason to keep reading for this very introspective and really quite intellectual approach to it. Dark Imperium is a strong novel and well worth a read. I'd say it has flaws, but I do think it's one of the most important novels in recent years, as it spends time breaking down the universe and setting up powerful adversaries that feel threatening but are also kindred spirits to Guilliman himself. I'd also go as far as to say it's a good choice for a newcomer to the lore of Warhammer 40,000. You'll be able to identify with Guilliman's sense of feeling slightly lost and confused and finding yourself with all these new toys you never knew you wanted. I can relate. Or maybe I'm just projecting a little bit here. In any case, it's a novel worth reading with a lot of strength to it. And for those who are newer to the universe, it puts everyone on an even playing field. We all know precisely where we stand on the universe. We know who's who, what the state of the Imperium is, and where all the factions within it largely line up. So it's a really good launch title for the new millennium, the new Dark Millennium, I should say, and we will have to see where it goes in the future.
So there we have it. We've got a bit more of a bitsy model today than we normally do. He's still in pits. I have built some of him, obviously, and I think we're going to call it there. So next time when we do Dark Imperium Plague War, I think we will finish him up. If anyone can guess what chapter he's from, then please do leave it in the comments, and I guess we'll find out how accurate you are next time. But thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, like and subscribe.